The office was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then came the sharp, commanding voice. Change quickly. Now. Go to the front office and find something suitable. You have 10 minutes. A chill ran down Mia's spine. She barely raised her head, only nodding shortly. Her expression was distant, almost dreamlike, as if she were somewhere far from the sterile office walls. Across the city, in a towering glass building, Jonathan Reed strode through the lobby with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent around him. Every step in his polished leather shoes echoed authority. Expensive suit, meticulously styled hair, and a scent of rich cologne that announced status before words ever could. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure bent over a mop in the hallway, a cleaning staff member in a gray uniform. His brow furrowed. It was far too early for anyone to be at work. His foot nearly met a slick patch of wet floor. Watch where you're going, he snapped, as she barely pulled the mop away in time. I'm sorry, she murmured softly. Why must you always get in the way? He muttered, regaining his balance, his irritation barely masked. He cast a glance at her, curiosity tinged with disdain, then continued toward the elevator, adjusting his cuffs with precision. Today was crucial. Jonathan had a meeting with 3 of his oldest business partners, Richard Sloan, Victor Lang, and Marcus Hale. Once allies, now distant and unpredictable. Jonathan suspected that something underhanded was brewing, whispers of deals made behind his back. And to make matters worse, his executive assistant had called in sick last night with a high fever. He stopped at the elevator and realized he might need a replacement, even just to hand papers and pour water. The clock was merciless. 10 minutes remained. His gaze fell on the young cleaning staff member, still leaning against the wall with her mop clutched to her chest. You've been here long? He asked unexpectedly. Since last year, she replied, calm and precise. Name? Mia, she answered. Can you follow instructions? Stay composed? Speak clearly and don't intervene unless asked. I can, she said. Good. Come with me. You'll sit in on the meeting. Just pass the water, don't draw attention. And make yourself presentable. Quickly, you have 10 minutes. Without protest, Mia nodded again and walked toward the assistant's office. 7 minutes later she returned, her appearance transformed. A crisp white blouse, dark pencil skirt, hair neatly pinned back, a light flush coloring her cheeks. Not glamorous but commanding in a quiet, understated way. There was an elegance in her restraint, a presence that couldn't be ignored. The stage was set. The conference room was a cavern of glass and steel, cold and imposing. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, but even the sunlight couldn't warm the atmosphere. A black glass table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs that looked more like thrones than office furniture. Jonathan Reed adjusted his tie for the 3rd time that morning. His pulse raced beneath the calm surface, though his face betrayed none of it. Today, he had to negotiate with 3 men whose reputations preceded them, Richard Sloan, Victor Lang, and Marcus Hale. Partners once loyal, now wolves in tailored suits, their smiles polite but calculating. Mia quietly poured water into their glasses, every movement precise and deliberate. She had learned quickly. In a room like this, mistakes were not forgiven, and silence could be as powerful as any argument. Richard Sloan was the first to speak, leaning back with a sly grin. Jonathan, always full of surprises. And this is your new assistant. His eyes flicked to Mia, measuring, testing. Where's your usual star? Unavailable, Jonathan replied, his voice steady, betraying none of his irritation. We'll manage. Victor Lang's fingers laced together, resting on the table with a calculated calm. Let's get straight to business. We have concerns about your share in the project. It seems some redistribution might be necessary. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had suspected this would come, but hearing it spoken aloud sharpened the danger. The room felt smaller suddenly, the cold glass walls pressing in. He watched Mia, wondering how someone so seemingly ordinary could move unnoticed in a room full of predators. Marcus Hale's voice was smooth, almost syrupy. We're not trying to push you out entirely, Jonathan. Just temper your influence. The company is bigger than any one person. Jonathan forced a smile, but his eyes flashed steel. He knew what they were attempting. a quiet corporate squeeze, a graceful eviction without a fight. His mind raced for leverage for any advantage. Mia remained calm, serene, almost invisible. Until Marcus, thinking to test her, addressed her directly. "And you, miss? Any thoughts?" She looked at him steadily, her voice soft but unwavering. "I've seen bolder moves in bankruptcy court, where partners devour each other for advantage. I think you underestimate Jonathan's position here." The room froze. Even the investors, masters of intimidation, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise. Jonathan blinked, processing her words, feeling a wave of relief and astonishment. "You understand?" he asked quietly, his tone no longer casual but edged with gratitude. "Better than you might realize," Mia replied. Her eyes scanned the documents on the table, noting irregularities and subtle manipulations. "And these papers, attempts at forced asset acquisition. If I'm correct, this borders on corporate coercion." Jonathan's hand hovered over the stack of documents, his face paling. The quiet, unassuming assistant he had nearly overlooked had just turned the tide. The power dynamic had shifted, silently but irrevocably. The office buzzed with a muted energy, the kind that only exists in buildings where millions of dollars and fragile egos collide daily. Phones rang in hurried rhythms, printers coughed up sheets in protest, and assistants darted from one office to the next like shadows in a maze. Mia moved through it all with quiet purpose, each step measured, each action deliberate. She observed the subtle currents of office politics, the whispered exchanges, the furtive glances, the tiny gestures that carried enormous meaning. To an outsider, she might have seemed like just another staff member. But today she was anything but ordinary. Jonathan strode past desks with his usual air of invincibility, a man convinced that control could be imposed simply by presence. Yet even he could feel the tension slicing through the air. Something was off. Partners who once smiled easily now spoke in measured tones. Old alliances had shifted, and the room, vast and modern as it was, felt suddenly cramped with unspoken threats. A misplaced file almost brought chaos. Mia caught it mid-fall, moving with reflexes that seemed more instinct than skill. She straightened it with a gentle flick of her wrist, eyes scanning the room to make sure no one had noticed. Just a small action, but in this arena, even small actions mattered. Jonathan's mind raced. Without his trusted assistant, the gears of his morning routine threatened to grind to a halt. Mia's calm efficiency was a quiet revelation. She filled the gaps he hadn't even realized existed. Water glasses refilled, folders handed discreetly, every small interaction handled with precision. The office machinery hummed around her, but she remained untouched by the chaos. A sudden interruption, a printer jam in the corner, would have sent any ordinary assistant into flustered panic. Mia, however, simply knelt, assessed the problem, and within seconds, had it working again. She stood, dusted her hands lightly, and moved on. Her composure was a contrast to the frantic energy surrounding her. And even Jonathan paused to watch, a flicker of admiration passing through his usually impassive expression. By the time the first investor arrived, Mia had already claimed her place, not by force, not by assertion, but by sheer competence and quiet command of the environment. And though Jonathan wouldn't have admitted it aloud yet, he understood that today, he was no longer alone in this game. The office, full of power players, ambitious minds, and veiled threats, was a battlefield. And Mia had just proven she could navigate it with ease. Jonathan paused at the conference room doorway, his pulse quickening. His usual assistant, Claire, had called in sick last night, leaving a gaping hole in the day's critical schedule. The three investors would arrive in minutes, and without support, even he, a man used to commanding every room, felt a twinge of unease. He glanced at Mia, standing quietly by the wall, hands folded, a neutral expression on her face. She was no longer just the cleaning staff. In these 10 minutes, she had transformed into a poised presence, ready to step into a world of subtle dangers and strategic maneuvering. "I need someone in this room," Jonathan muttered, more to himself than to her. "At least to hand out documents, pour water, nothing more." Mia's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "I can manage that," she said calmly. Jonathan hesitated, measuring the risk. He had almost dismissed her earlier, assuming she belonged to the background of office life. Now, faced with an empty chair where his trusted ally should have been, he realized he had no choice but to trust her. The clock ticked down, and soon the first of the investors appeared. Richard Sloane entered with a confident smirk, followed closely by Victor Lang and Marcus Hale. Each man carried the air of someone accustomed to dominance, their designer suits, gleaming watches, and subtle smirks announcing power long before words did. Jonathan motioned Mia forward. "Sit with us. Stay quiet, observe, pass what's needed. Do not speak unless asked." Mia nodded. She pulled out a chair and positioned herself at the far side of the table, just out of the main line of attention. She remained composed, letting Jonathan handle introductions and greetings, yet her presence was far from unnoticed. Her calm, meticulous movements contrasted sharply with the investor's calculated gestures, subtly shifting the room's energy. Jonathan could feel eyes flicking toward her, curiosity mingled with condescension. He ignored it, focusing instead on the documents spread across the table. He needed to maintain control, even as the absence of his trusted assistant left him exposed. Mia quietly handed out papers as needed, pouring water and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But behind the composed exterior, she was absorbing every detail. The tone of each investor, the tiny shifts in posture, the flickers of hesitation. The empty chair, once a source of panic for Jonathan, had been filled, not by a replacement of equal rank, but by someone whose silence and precision made her more effective than any assistant could have been. For the first time that morning, he realized that today's meeting might not just survive his assistant's absence. It might turn in his favor. Mia adjusted the cuff of her blouse, smoothing out the last wrinkle with a subtle flick of her fingers. She had only 7 minutes to reinvent herself from unnoticed office staff to someone who could operate in a room full of sharks, and she had done it. Not with glamour or spectacle, but with quiet precision, an aura of calm that commanded respect without a word. Jonathan watched her from across the room, momentarily forgetting the tension that had plagued him since the morning. There was a new energy in her posture, a measured confidence that seemed to fill the space around her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, yet everyone in the room sensed her presence. Her transformation was more than appearance. The way she held herself, poised, aware, unflinching, spoke of someone who had navigated storms before, who understood how to move without making waves yet leave a mark. She wasn't flashy, but she radiated control, a subtle authority that was impossible to ignore. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair, a flicker of admiration passing through his usually impassive eyes. He had underestimated her, assuming she would be a placeholder, a temporary measure until Claire returned. Instead, she had become an asset he hadn't realized he needed. The investors had begun to take notice as well. Richard Sloane's sly glances lingered longer than necessary. Victor Lang's polite smirk carried a hint of curiosity. Even Marcus Hale, ever composed, shifted slightly in his chair, eyes tracking Mia's movements. Mia passed out the last of the documents, her hands steady, every glass refilled, every folder handed with discretion. Yet in those small actions, she conveyed competence, calm, and an almost imperceptible assertion of authority. Jonathan cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. "Shall we begin?" he asked. But his mind lingered on her. This quiet force who had entered his life unexpectedly, ready to tip the balance in ways he couldn't yet fully measure. The transformation was complete. Mia had crossed the line from observer to indispensable presence. And though the investors didn't yet realize it, the game had just shifted. The real test, Jonathan knew, was about to begin. The doors closed behind the last investor, and the room's atmosphere shifted instantly, subtle but palpable. Jonathan felt it, a tension that prickled his skin, the invisible weight of experience and ambition pressing in from all sides. The trio, Richard Sloane, Victor Lang, and Marcus Hale, exuded confidence, wealth, and the faint menace of men used to getting what they wanted. Mia remained at her post, poised at the edge of the table, a silent observer with a presence that somehow altered the room's dynamics. Her hands moved smoothly, passing papers and refilling glasses, but her eyes were sharp, noting posture, gestures, and unspoken exchanges. She wasn't just watching. She was reading the currents beneath the surface. Richard leaned back, a predatory smile on his face. Jonathan, always full of surprises. And this, he gestured subtly toward Mia. Your new assistant? Where is Claire, the usual star of the show? Unavailable, Jonathan said firmly, his tone measured. We'll manage. Victor's fingers drummed lightly against the table, his voice smooth and deliberate. Let's get to the point. We've reviewed your share of the project. Redistribution seems necessary. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He had anticipated this, but hearing it aloud brought a cold clarity. They were testing him, gauging his reaction. The investors were playing for control, and he was the target. Marcus Hale leaned forward slightly, his polished expression calm, but his words sharp. We're not asking you to step aside entirely, Jonathan. Just reduce your influence. The company isn't a one-man show. Jonathan forced a polite smile, hiding the flicker of anger that rose. But Mia, standing quietly at the edge, caught his eye. She understood the situation before he could act, her gaze calm and analytical. Then, unexpectedly, Marcus addressed her. And you, miss? What's your take? The room fell silent, a subtle test thrown at someone who had been assumed invisible. Mia's voice was steady, soft but commanding. I've seen bolder maneuvers in bankruptcy courts, where partners try to consume each other for advantage. I think you may be underestimating Jonathan's position. The words landed like a jolt. The investors froze, their confident masks flickering with surprise. Jonathan blinked, a mix of relief and astonishment coursing through him. Someone in this room understood the stakes, and she wasn't afraid to speak. He leaned closer to her as she discreetly handed over documents. You understand? Better than you think, Mia replied calmly, scanning the files with practiced precision. And these papers, attempts at forced acquisition. If I'm correct, this skirts the edge of corporate coercion. Jonathan's hand hovered over the documents, his face paling. The quiet, unassuming assistant he had barely noticed had just tipped the balance. For the first time in the morning, he realized the meeting might not only survive his assistant's absence, it might turn in his favor. Mia's silent power was already reshaping the battlefield. The conference room had grown colder somehow, as if Mia's words had drained the warmth from the polished glass and steel. Jonathan's eyes scanned the investors' faces, searching for cracks, but all three men masked their surprise with practiced ease, though the subtle tension betrayed them. Mia stepped closer to the documents on the table, her fingers grazing the edges with a deliberate calm. These papers, she said quietly, show a planned forced acquisition. If executed, it would shift control of assets under duress. Legally, it borders on corporate coercion. Richard Sloane's brow arched. Excuse me? Mia's gaze swept the room, steady and unflinching. If someone attempted this in a court of law, it could be challenged as illegitimate. And these signatures and clauses, she tapped the files lightly, leave gaps that could unravel the entire plan. Jonathan felt a rush of relief, quickly replaced by astonishment. The assistant he had summoned on a whim was now dictating the room's tempo. His investors, masters of manipulation, now hesitated under the scrutiny of someone they had dismissed as inconsequential. Victor Lang cleared his throat, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. And you understand this fully? Mia's eyes met his without wavering. Better than you might imagine. I've worked with corporate raiders before, seen their maneuvers, their threats, and the ways they attempt to dominate through fear. Today you forgot one critical factor: vigilance. Jonathan leaned back slightly, exhaling. He had underestimated her completely. The calm, silent presence that had seemed insignificant just minutes ago was now the linchpin of his defense. Marcus Hale's polite smile tightened into a thin line. And you claim to have seen all this before? Yes, Mia said simply. And you left documents on the table that expose your strategy. You may have thought you were subtle, but the law, and a careful eye, can see everything. A silence fell, heavy and electric. Jonathan watched the investors, who had always exuded control, now falter under her quiet authority. For the first time, they realized they had underestimated the stakes. Jonathan's voice broke the tension, low and controlled. Everything here is cancelled. You'll leave. Now. The investors hesitated, then rose, their eyes cold but wary. Richard Sloane lingered at the doorway. This isn't over, Jonathan. Just the beginning. The door closed behind them, leaving Jonathan and Mia alone in the cavernous room. The papers lay before him, a stark reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. And yet it was Mia, quiet, composed, underestimated, who had saved him at the last moment. Jonathan finally looked at her, eyes wide, pulse still racing. You knew, he said quietly. You saw what they were planning. Mia inclined her head. I recognized the patterns. I've been in these situations before. You're fortunate I was here. Jonathan felt a strange mixture of awe and gratitude. In that moment he understood. The battle was far from over, but with her by his side, the odds had shifted. Jonathan sank into the chair opposite Mia, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished glass table. The office was quiet now, the chaos of the investors' confrontation replaced by a charged stillness. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself to see her not as a temporary stand-in, but as something far more vital. A partner, a strategist, a presence he could trust. You knew what they were up to, he said softly, almost to himself. And yet, you didn't just warn me. You acted. Mia remained calm, her hands folded neatly on her lap. It wasn't just observation. I've been in similar situations before. I know the patterns. The threats, the manipulations, they're all predictable if you know where to look. Jonathan leaned back, studying her. There was a depth to her composure, a quiet intelligence that he hadn't expected from someone who had appeared so ordinary moments ago. I didn't realize. I didn't know I needed someone like you. She tilted her head slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. And now you do. Jonathan's mind raced. Until today, he had trusted only himself. But Mia had proven that competence and insight could exist where he hadn't even considered looking. I need someone I can rely on. Not just to assist me, but to anticipate, to challenge, to think strategically. Can you be that person? Mia's smile widened just a fraction. I can be that person. But we work as equals. No blind loyalty, no flattere, no pretense. You'll have my honesty, whether you like it or not. Jonathan nodded slowly, a sense of relief washing over him. Good. Because I need someone like that. The people around me. I didn't realize how many wolves were waiting, pretending to be allies. I know, she said calmly. I've seen it before. But you're aware now, and awareness changes everything. He extended his hand, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as one strategist acknowledging another. Welcome to the team, Mia. Truly. She took it firmly, a gesture that sealed the unspoken pact between them. I'm ready, she said simply. But understand this. The battles won't get easier. And neither will the people around you. Jonathan exhaled, a mixture of relief and determination settling in. For the first time in a long while he felt a sense of partnership, of strategy shared and support genuine. The war in the boardroom had been won, but the greater campaign, the survival and success of his company, was just beginning. Mia's presence was no longer an accident. It was a turning point. And Jonathan knew that with her by his side, he had found the edge he had been missing all along. The office hummed with quiet efficiency, the familiar rhythm of a well-oiled machine. But now one presence stood out above the rest, Mia. Her steps were confident, precise, and purposeful as she moved through the halls in a tailored suit that spoke of authority without ostentation. She no longer blended into the background. She commanded respect simply by being herself. Her office, labeled advisor to the CEO, sat strategically next to Jonathan's, a testament to the trust and partnership they had forged. Staff from every level of the company, from security guards to managers, greeted her with a nod or a smile, acknowledging not just her role, but the impact she had made in safeguarding the company's future. Mia paused briefly outside the break room. A young secretary fumbled with a jammed copier, red-faced and muttering under her breath. Mia bent down effortlessly, guiding the paper tray into place with practiced hands. The printer whirred to life, and the secretary looked up wide-eyed. "Thank you so much," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. Mia gave a small, calm smile. "No problem. Just pay attention next time." As she straightened, her gaze fell on a curious detail. A ring on the secretary's hand, unusual in size and bearing the insignia of one of the city's oldest investment families.
Mia paused, intrigued.
"Excuse me," she said softly, stepping closer. "Whose niece are you?" The girl startled slightly but quickly composed herself, offering a polite smile. "Just observing," she replied. "I'm curious how things work here." Mia nodded, satisfied for the moment, and continued down the corridor. Yet her attention lingered on the ring, a signal that a new story, a fresh challenge was already forming. Her instincts told her that the quiet corridors of the office were only the beginning of what was to come. Jonathan's office came into view, and Mia's stride remained steady. A year had passed since that morning of chaos, yet the lessons endured. Vigilance, composure, and insight were far more valuable than status or appearances. The company had survived, thrived even, thanks to the quiet force that had once been overlooked. Mia's mind was already alert, aware that the next challenge might be closer than anyone realized. But she moved with confidence. She was ready, always ready. The office had settled into its usual rhythm, yet Mia sensed a subtle shift in the air, like the first tremor before a storm. 1 year of victories, lessons, and quiet influence had transformed her from a background presence into the strategic heart of the company. But even with that experience, she knew that true challenges were rarely announced. They arrived unbidden, hidden in the mundane. She passed a young intern struggling with a presentation tablet, pausing to offer a few calm, precise instructions. The intern's eyes lit up, and gratitude shone in their expression. Small victories, Mia reminded herself, often paved the way for greater triumphs. Then something caught her attention. A young assistant at the copier, fumbling with a jam tray. She moved toward the girl, helping her guide the paper into place. As the printer hummed back to life, Mia noticed the unusual ring on the girl's hand. Large, ornate, marked with the crest of a prominent investment family. Her curiosity sharpened. Observing quietly, she asked, "And whose niece are you?" The girl paused, startled, then smiled with polite composure. "Just observing. I like to see how things are run here." Mia nodded slowly, her mind already turning over possibilities. This was more than a curious glance. It was a hint, a sign that the next story, the next challenge, was already forming. The quiet corridors of the office were fertile ground for new intrigue, and Mia knew her instincts were right. The story wasn't over. It was only beginning. She continued down the hall, confident, poised, aware. 1 year had changed everything. She had grown stronger, sharper, more vigilant. But she also knew that the world she navigated demanded constant attention. Every glance, every gesture, every small detail could signal the start of a new battle. And Mia was ready, always ready. As she passed Jonathan's office, she caught his eye. A subtle nod passed between them, acknowledgement of trust, partnership, and the unspoken understanding that together, they could face whatever came next. The story had shifted, but the fight for influence, strategy, and survival in the corporate world was far from over. And somewhere in the corridors of glass and steel, a new chapter was quietly beginning.